Gavin Newsom walked into the CNN studio looking like he'd already rehearsed the highlight reel. The slicked-back hair, the expensive suit, the practiced grin. He carried the kind of confidence that plays well on camera and even better in donor rooms. J.D. Vance, sitting across from him, didn't look impressed so much as curious, like a man watching someone try to sell a luxury car while the engine light is blinking. CNN billed it as Two Visions for America, a tidy little framing that assumes both visions are equally grounded in results. But the energy in the room said something else. A lot of people came to see whether California's story could survive a hard cross-examination. The network seemed to expect a familiar contrast: coastal polish versus Rust Belt bluntness, charisma versus grievance, the governor as grown-up, the senator as agitator. Instead, Vance arrived with the vibe of someone who didn't plan to argue about vibes at all. He had thick folders, yes, but more importantly, he had a strategy. Force the conversation out of slogans and into outcomes. Newsom's supporters were ready to clap for climate talk and compassionate rhetoric, while Vance's side looked like they'd come to watch a scoreboard. And once you notice that, you realize this wasn't really a debate about ideology. It was a debate about whether reality still gets a vote. Jake Tapper opened with the usual plea for civility, the kind that sounds noble right up until the first uncomfortable clip hits the screen. Jake Tapper. Newsom smiled like the request was meant for the other guy, which is a tell you learn to spot after watching too many politicians. When it was his turn, Newsom delivered the California sales pitch with the smooth cadence of a man who knows the camera loves him. He talked about innovation, diversity, compassion, and the future. And he spoke as if California's problems were just the price of being ahead of the curve. Then he turned toward Vance and framed him as yesterday's America, the kind of rhetorical move that works best when nobody interrupts. Vance didn't interrupt at first. He waited, let the applause roll, then responded with the tone of someone correcting the record, rather than picking a fight. He challenged the idea that California was growing, pointing out that population trends and public frustration had become part of the state's national reputation. He didn't call Newsom a liar. He made it sound like Newsom was reciting an outdated brochure. And then he pivoted to the one image that always lands, because it doesn't require a policy degree to understand: the French Laundry photos. The screens filled with the now famous dinner at the French Laundry, and the temperature in the room dropped instantly. Vance didn't claim the photo proved malice. He framed it as a symbol that Americans couldn't unsee. He read back pandemic-era guidance the public remembers: limits on gatherings, calls for caution, the moral pressure to comply. Then he juxtaposed those words with the image of a table full of powerful people enjoying an evening that didn't look like sacrifice. If you're trying to defend leadership in a crisis, that contrast is the kind of thing that makes your explanation sound like a technicality. Newsom tried to move quickly to the apology he'd already given years ago. Vance didn't let the moment drift into "I owned it" next question, because he wasn't chasing repentance, he was chasing credibility. He asked, in effect, whether "we're all in this together" is a principle or just a line used to manage the public. He framed the dinner as one of those events that may not change the rules on paper, but changes how people feel about the people making the rules. And once the conversation is about trust, you're no longer debating public health. You're debating legitimacy. From there, Vance shifted to homelessness, and he did it in a way that avoided easy moral grandstanding. He didn't mock people living on the street. He questioned the systems that keep people there. He referenced widely reported counts that place California at the top of the national homelessness list and pointed out that the state's unsheltered numbers are often what shock visitors. Instead of treating it as a partisan punchline, he treated it as a governance failure measured in human misery. Then he asked the question that always makes bureaucracies nervous. Where did all the money go? And what did it actually buy? On the screens, the images weren't theoretical. Underpasses, sidewalk tents, trash piles, makeshift camps that looked permanent. Vance described the state's multi-billion-dollar spending efforts as something that, at minimum, invites scrutiny when conditions still appear to worsen in many places. He didn't say the money was stolen. He suggested that the public has reason to suspect the spending pipeline is built for contractors and consultants, not for results. He referenced audits and reports that have criticized inefficiency, fragmentation, and the sheer complexity of the homeless services web. And he leaned into an almost cruel arithmetic. If the spending is that large and the visible crisis remains, what exactly is being purchased besides frustration? Newsom responded with the standard argument that California is big, expensive, and dealing with problems other states export or ignore. Vance countered by pointing out that big isn't a moral exemption when you're also claiming to be the national model. He brought up the reality that building anything in California can be slow and costly, and he asked whether layers of regulation and process have become a kind of self-licking ice cream cone. If a unit of housing costs what a mansion costs in other states, is that compassion, or is it dysfunction dressed up as virtue? It's a brutal question, because it attacks the system without attacking the person sleeping in the tent. Then came San Francisco, and Vance handled it like a prosecutor walking toward a witness with a photo that doesn't care about rhetoric. He referenced public reporting about street conditions, sanitation complaints, business closures, and the feeling, for many residents, that basic order has eroded. He didn't say, "The city is dead," but he asked why a place that once symbolized American prosperity now symbolizes American dysfunction for so many people. San Francisco. He brought up the existence of apps and maps residents use to report street hazards and sanitation issues, and he framed that as a sign of normalization. When a problem gets a dedicated interface, it's no longer occasional. It's integrated into daily life. Newsom tried to broaden the lens. Housing shortage, mental health, addiction, a nationwide crisis concentrated in big coastal cities. Vance agreed those forces exist, then asked why California's solutions seem to produce the most expensive outcomes with the least visible improvement. He didn't deny good intention. He questioned whether good intentions have become an excuse for tolerating decay. He pointed out that voters aren't grading compassion as a feeling. They're grading it as a result. And if the result is sidewalk misery plus skyrocketing costs, people start suspecting the policy class is insulated from the consequences. The conversation turned to migration. And again, Vance framed it carefully. Not everyone is fleeing, but enough people are leaving that it's become a political fact. He referenced census-era coverage about net outflow trends and the symbolism of California losing a congressional seat. Newsom tried to argue that people come and go, that the state remains desirable, that jobs and culture still pull people in. Vance's response was simple. Desirability doesn't matter if normal families can't afford to stay. And that's the line that hits hardest because it's not ideological. It's personal for anyone who's been priced out of anywhere. Vance then moved into a corporate exodus narrative, citing companies that have moved headquarters or significant operations out of California over recent years. Tesla. He didn't pretend every move was purely political. He framed it as a cost and regulation story that businesses tell investors and employees. Oracle. He cited names people recognize and asked what it means when a state known for opportunity starts looking, to some employers, like a trap. Hewlett-Packard Newsom argued that California still leads in talent and innovation, and Vance didn't deny it. He just asked why talent increasingly wants to live somewhere else once it gets married, has kids, or tries to buy a house. That launched the cost of living segment, where numbers do what speeches can't. Vance compared housing prices, rent burdens, gas costs, and utility bills in a way that made the higher wages defense feel thin. Newsom tried to frame high costs as the price of high quality, the kind of argument that sounds persuasive until you realize it assumes people can pay the price. Vance's point was that quality doesn't matter if it's locked behind a gate only the wealthy can open. And he described a state where the middle class can feel squeezed from both sides, too rich for assistance, too poor for comfort. He didn't call Newsom personally corrupt or indifferent, but he did draw a class contrast that's hard to shake. Newsom, he implied, speaks fluently in the dialect of elite reassurance. Everything is hard. Everything is complex. Trust the experts. Stay the course. Vance spoke in the dialect of household math. If your paycheck rises a little and your rent rises a lot, you are losing. That's not a culture war argument. It's an argument about whether policy elites understand basic life constraints. And in a country where plenty of people feel financially cornered, the household math argument tends to win. Crime and retail theft came next, and Vance treated it like another results question rather than a morality play. He referenced the public debate around Proposition 47 and how critics say it reduced deterrence for certain theft offenses. Proposition 47. He displayed clips that have circulated for years, smash-and-grab footage, shelves cleared, employees instructed not to intervene, while acknowledging that viral video can oversimplify complex trends. Then he asked why so many retailers publicly cited theft concerns when closing stores in parts of California. Newsom pushed back with broader crime data and national patterns, but Vance kept circling back to the street-level reality people see. The most effective part wasn't the video, it was the question underneath it. If policy is meant to protect ordinary people, why do ordinary people increasingly feel unprotected in places run by progressive leadership? If reform is meant to improve justice, why does it sometimes feel like the honest worker is the only person expected to follow the rules? Vance didn't claim reforms are inherently wrong. He suggested California may have tested reforms in ways that ignored predictable human behavior. When people believe consequences don't exist, some people will act like consequences don't exist. And no amount of rhetoric changes that. Energy was the final big subject, and Vance framed it around a contradiction that critics love to hammer. California has pushed aggressive electrification goals, including future-facing transportation policies, while residents have experienced grid stress and high rates. Newsom defended the long-term transition, pointing to climate risk and the need to lead. Vance asked whether leadership means announcing ambitious targets or making sure the basics work reliably at a price families can handle. He brought up nuclear debates, including Diablo Canyon, not as a gotcha, but as an example of ideology colliding with engineering. Diablo Canyon Power Plant. Newsom argued that transitions are messy, that legacy infrastructure takes time to update, and that California is investing heavily. Vance's response was that investing heavily is exactly what California says about everything. And yet, the lived experience still feels unstable for many residents. He didn't deny climate change or insult renewables. He implied California sometimes confuses symbolic leadership with functional governance. He noted that telling people to buy into a future that costs more while the present feels less reliable is a bad sales pitch. And he made it personal. Families don't experience transition, they experience bills. By the end, Newsom looked less like a lecturer and more like a defendant in a case about a model that's lost its shine. Vance looked like a man who had decided the safest place in American politics is behind a stack of outcomes you can point to. The studio audience reflected that tension. Some still clapped for Newsom's ideals, but others seemed stuck on the images and comparisons. This is the trap of modern political argument. Lofty language can't erase what people think they see with their own eyes. And once the debate becomes your message versus my footage, the message has to work a lot harder. Afterward, the conversation online predictably split into two movies. In one movie, Vance exposed Newsom with receipts that supposedly prove California is a mess, and Newsom is the face of elite hypocrisy. In the other movie, Vance cherry-picked problems any large state has and turned them into a caricature for partisan gain. Both movies are emotionally satisfying, which should make you suspicious because politics that feels too satisfying usually means something got simplified. But what nobody could deny is that the clash hit a nerve America has been poking for years. The gap between what leaders say and what life feels like. The deeper story wasn't French laundry or tent footage or corporate logos. It was the collision between two styles of authority, Newsom's authority of credentialed competence and moral framing, and Vance's authority of skepticism and lived experience talk. Newsom asked the public to trust his intentions and his state's identity as the vanguard. Vance asked the public to trust their own frustration, their own cost calculations, their own patience wearing thin. And when those two forms of authority collide, the winner usually depends on which emotion is stronger that year, hope or resentment. If you're trying to read what this means beyond the theatrics, you have to ask a few uncomfortable questions. Is California's reputation nationally being shaped more by real conditions or by the way opponents package those conditions? When voters see the same viral images over and over, do they start believing the entire state looks that way, even when it doesn't? At the same time, when leaders insist problems are exaggerated, do they accidentally confirm the suspicion that elites dismiss what ordinary people notice? And if a state calls itself the model, doesn't it invite harsher judgment when the model looks unaffordable, disorderly, or unstable? The segment also revealed something about modern ambition. Newsom clearly wants to be seen as a national figure, someone with presidential gravitas, someone who can translate California's brand into America's future. Vance clearly wants to be seen as the counter-elite, the guy who walks into glamorous studios and drags the conversation back down to the sidewalk and the grocery bill. One sells aspiration, the other sells suspicion. Both are selling something, and the buyer is the same. A country looking for a story that explains why life feels harder than it should. And maybe the sharpest takeaway is the simplest. If your opponents can summarize your governance with one viral photo, you're already in trouble. If your defenders can't rebut that summary without sounding like they're changing the subject, you're in deeper trouble. Newsom's challenge isn't that critics exist, it's that the criticisms have become easy to visualize. Vance's challenge isn't that his case is persuasive. It's that persuasion can morph into certainty faster than the facts deserve. So the debate ended the way most modern debates end, not with resolution, but with reinforcement. Newsom's fans left thinking he stood for compassion and modernity against a sneering attack. Vance's fans left thinking he punctured a glossy narrative with outcomes that don't care about polish. Independents probably left thinking some of both is true, which is also why independents are always the least satisfied audience. And the rest of the country got exactly what it craves right now, a neat, dramatic confrontation that feels like an answer, even when it's mostly a question wearing a suit. What happened after the lights went down was almost more revealing than what happened on camera. Newsom's team went into full cleanup mode, pushing the idea that Vance had built a highlight reel out of worst-case images and convenient comparisons. Vance's team did what modern politics always does. They broke the debate into bite-sized clips, each one designed to feel like a complete argument by itself. And the public, as usual, didn't wait for anyone to fact-check the mood. They decided what the mood meant and called it truth. If you're wondering why politics feels like a constant hangover now, it's because we keep drinking mood and calling it evidence. The French Laundry moment became the centerpiece because it's the kind of visual that won't stop working. People don't argue about it like they argue about a spreadsheet. They react to it like they react to a betrayal in a movie. Even if you think the incident is old news, the symbolism stays fresh because it fits a story Americans already suspect is real. The rules are for you, not for them. Newsom can say he apologized, can say he learned, can say it was a lapse, and some voters will accept that. But others will always remember how easily public guidance turns into private exceptions when you're powerful enough. That's the trap for charismatic leaders who build their brand on moral messaging. Once you position yourself as the adult in the room, your mistakes don't look like normal mistakes. They look like hypocrisy. Once you frame your opponents as reckless, any moment that suggests you're casually bending rules becomes a referendum on your character. And because politics is now mostly a contest of storylines, not resumes, one photo can outweigh 10 press conferences. It's not fair, but it is real, and leaders ignore it at their own peril. Vance's approach was smarter than people want to admit, even if they hate his politics. He didn't try to win by sounding smarter than Newsom. He tried to win by sounding like the guy who thinks he's being talked down to. He didn't argue California's intent. He argued California's outcomes, and outcomes are harder to filibuster. When Newsom spoke in sweeping moral language, Vance answered with household math and images that feel like lived experience. It's the rhetorical equivalent of pulling the conversation out of a seminar and into a kitchen table argument. But the kitchen table argument has its own danger, because it can become allergic to complexity. The homelessness discussion is a perfect example. You can show tent encampments and still fail to explain why they exist and why they persist. If you only show the most extreme images, viewers start believing the extreme is the whole story. And that's how caricatures are born. At the same time, if leaders respond by saying it's complicated, viewers hear we have excuses because they've been trained to. So both sides end up reinforcing each other. One side simplifies, the other side deflects, and the public gets angrier. Newsom's defenders tried to broaden the frame by pointing out that California carries national burdens. Weather draws people in. Geography limits housing. Coastal economies attract migration. Big cities concentrate poverty. And mental illness doesn't vanish at the state border. Those points aren't crazy, they're part of reality. And pretending they don't exist is intellectually lazy. But the public doesn't vote on intellectual honesty. It votes on whether life feels manageable. And when a state becomes famous for being unmanageable, explanations start sounding like permission slips. The business exodus argument worked the same way. It's true that companies move for many reasons: taxes, regulation, labor markets, branding, executives' preferences, and simple momentum. But when people see a cluster of high-profile moves, they don't interpret it like a nuanced case study. They interpret it like a warning sign. They hear, "The smart money is leaving," and they start wondering if they should leave too. Newsom can say California still leads in innovation, and it can be true. But the vibe of escape is contagious once it takes hold. Housing is where Newsom had the least room to maneuver. Because it's where California's brand clashes with most people's bank accounts. A state can be beautiful and still be financially impossible for ordinary families, and that contradiction eats away at the idea of California as a model. Newsom's supporters talk about desirability like it's a compliment, but desirability without affordability becomes exclusion with better marketing. Vance didn't have to prove anything about intentions. He only had to repeat the basic fact that a middle-class salary doesn't buy a middle-class life in much of California. The moment you accept that, the debate stops being abstract and starts feeling personal. Crime and retail theft is where the conversation becomes most vulnerable to manipulation, because it's easy to weaponize fear and easy to dismiss legitimate frustration. One side shows clips of people walking out with merchandise and says the entire system is broken. The other side points to national trends and says the clips are cherry-picked, which can also be true, and still not address what residents are dealing with. The honest middle is uncomfortable. Reforms can be necessary, and implementation can still be sloppy, and enforcement can still be uneven, and public order still matters. Vance's advantage is that he talks about public order like it's common sense, and common sense has a lot of political muscle right now. Energy was a preview of the next decade's political fight, because it's where moral ambition collides with mechanical reality. Newsom wants California to be the future, and the future he sells is cleaner, electrified, and climate-forward. Vance wants to make the future sound like a luxury product that breaks on delivery and sends you the bill for repairs. If people experience high costs and occasional instability, they start questioning whether transition is just a fancy word for you pay more. And the more they question it, the more politicians like Vance can frame climate ambition as elite theater rather than practical policy. The larger truth is that both men are performing roles that America keeps rewarding. Newsom is the polished executive who speaks in the language of values and inevitability, as if history itself is his campaign consultant. Vance is the skeptic who speaks in the language of consequences, as if he's the only adult willing to say the quiet part out loud. Newsom sells direction, Vance sells accountability. And because Americans are divided on what they want more right now, vision or discipline, both roles can thrive, even when neither delivers real resolution. If you want to understand why the debate landed so hard, forget the partisan scorekeeping and look at the emotional supply chain. Millions of people feel like the country has become unaffordable, unstable, and unfair, and they're desperate for a clean explanation. Newsom's message is that we can build a compassionate future if we trust institutions and invest big. Vance's message is that institutions are already failing you, and big investments are often just money poured into a machine that protects itself. Those are not just political messages. They're competing emotional answers to the same national anxiety. Here's the question that kept quietly surfacing beneath everything. What happens when a model becomes a warning label? California used to be sold as America's dream factory, the place where ambition paid off and reinvention was possible. Now it's increasingly sold, fairly or unfairly, as a place where the math doesn't work unless you're wealthy enough to ignore the math. Is that a temporary swing in reputation driven by viral imagery, or is it a long-term shift driven by structural problems that won't be solved by better messaging? And if it's structural, why should the rest of the country import policies from a place that can't seem to make its own basics feel stable? Newsom tried to answer that by leaning into California's achievements, the economy, innovation, cultural influence, environmental leadership. But Vance attacked the weak point in that argument. You can't eat GDP. People don't live inside fifth largest economy as a statistic. They live inside rent, gas, school quality, public safety, and whether they can plan a future. A state can be rich and still be brutal to live in if the wealth is concentrated and the cost structure is punishing. And when voters start believing that's the case, the California Leads slogan starts sounding like a brand campaign, not a promise. The debate also revealed something about how media framing backfires. CNN wanted two visions, but the audience wanted who's responsible for what I'm seeing. When Newsom spoke like a national figure, Vance treated him like a manager being asked to explain performance. That mismatch is why Newsom's polish sometimes looked like evasion. He was selling a story while Vance was interrogating a ledger. If the public mood is enough with the story, the person holding the ledger wins, even if the ledger is selective. None of this means Vance proved everything he implied, and that's the part a lot of viewers conveniently ignore. Implying is easier than proving, and politics has become the art of implication packaged as certainty. A sharp presenter can stack images and numbers in a way that makes a conclusion feel inevitable, even when the underlying causal chain is complicated. That doesn't make the critique worthless. It just means the audience should resist turning a powerful performance into a blanket verdict. The honest viewer takes the hit of uncertainty. Some criticisms are fair, some are exaggerated, and sorting them out is work. But the honest viewer also notices something else. Newsom's style depends on the public granting him trust up front. He talks like someone confident. The audience will assume good faith, assume competence, assume the machine is mostly working. Vance talks like someone confident. The audience already suspects the machine is broken and wants proof it isn't. That's why Vance can attack with skepticism and get applause, while Newsom has to persuade people to stop being skeptical. In a skeptical era, that's a brutal assignment. So the real cliffhanger after the debate wasn't who won. It was whether Democrats, nationally, can keep selling California-style governance as the future without addressing the parts of California that make ordinary people uneasy. And on the Republican side, it was whether Vance can keep weaponizing California as a warning without falling into lazy caricature that turns real human problems into props. Because if both sides keep using the state as a political stage set, the actual residents become background noise in someone else's storyline. And that's when politics stops being about governance and becomes pure content, slick, addictive, and, in the long run, exhausting.